Thank you to everyone for being here, and to Hillary and Davin also for organizing. I'm happy for the chance to share my research about whether journalists help investors by analyzing or merely by disseminating firms' earnings news. In this context, dissemination means making investors more aware of firms' information, and by analysis, I mean creating new information, either by introducing new ideas or by synthesizing pre-existing information. Prior research has already made some progress addressing whether the media helps disseminate and/or analyze earnings. To this point, the evidence suggested that media dissemination, but not analysis, impacts the market's response to earnings announcements. But this result is really puzzling because several news outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, spend tens of millions of dollars a year creating thousands of earnings-related articles that emphasize analysis, not merely dissemination. So in my paper, I reconsider whether investors' reactions to earnings news vary with media-generated analysis. And I predict that journalists' editorial content, earnings-related editorial content, helps investors gauge firms' prospects, leading to more trading volume and more efficient prices. And my tests of this prediction suggest that high analysis news articles do enhance investors' reactions to earnings. Now, there are several reasons that media analysis might impact or facilitate investors' trading decisions. Journalists might parse value-relevant information from very technical accounting disclosures, synthesize information from a variety of sources, put the firm's news in the context of industry or economy-wide trends, and emphasize bad or sensitive news that the firm's managers and analysts don't have incentives to disclose. However, journalists might also have no effect on investors' decisions and simply provide articles to amuse day traders, perhaps because journalists lack sufficient expertise in finance and accounting. Or they might even have a negative effect, perhaps because they distract investors from value-relevant information by highlighting irrelevant issues. Now, there are several aspects of my methodology that allowed me to document my results. First, I focus on the S&P 500, highly visible firms that attract many readers' attention and as a result also attract in-depth coverage by the media. I also focus on Wall Street Journal articles, which are well known for providing in-depth and sometimes exclusive coverage. Now, these two innovations are pretty simple to implement, but I believe they're essential and the main reasons that prior studies failed to find evidence of the media's analysis role at earnings announcements. To address concerns that my results are driven by variation in announcements' newsworthiness, I also exploit multiple restructuring events at the Journal that produced plausibly exogenous variation in some firms' earnings coverage. And I compare the text of the firm's press release and the associated Wall Street Journal article to identify articles that create the most information instead of simply retransmitting what the firm already said. Because media coverage is endogenous to the firms and news being covered, identifying the impact of media coverage on investors' decisions is a real challenge. So to address this concern, this issue, I use these restructuring events at the Journal because changes in coverage around one of these events are less likely to have been determined endogenously by firm, reporter, or announcement-specific factors, and more likely to have been driven by changes in the journal's high-level operating strategy. This figure shows variation in the number of S&P 500 earnings announcements covered by the Journal over time, and we can see in this figure how these restructuring events impacted coverage. First, in 2007, the Journal realized that more people were finding out about breaking news events online. So they began to provide more exclusive or scoop articles, and as you can see in the figure, started covering fewer breaking news events such as earnings announcements. Then in 2008, Rupert Murdoch took over the Journal, and he was annoyed, and had been for several years, at this emphasis of the Journal on exclusive or scoop articles. So he instructed his editors to quit pretending the paper wasn't in the business of breaking news, and as you can see, they quickly obeyed. Then in 2013, the journal's newsroom merged with the Dow Jones newswires, which, as you can see, vastly increased the number of journalists and articles covering earnings. I use coverage changes that happen around one of these events because they're more likely to have been exogenously determined, while changes during other periods are more likely to have been driven endogenously by factors that aren't independent of firms' newsworthiness. Using the 2007 event to illustrate, the treatment group is made up of about 50 firms that the journal covered before but not after this first event. The key assumption here is that these firms' coverage changed only because the journal decided to only cover the 130 most visible firms instead of the 180 most visible firms. However, some of these changes certainly might have happened because the firm's newsworthiness changed. To address this possibility, I also, as a result, matched treated and control firms on both the level and recent changes in their newsworthiness. The control group is made up of about 320 firms the journal didn't cover either before or after the event, and about 130 firms the journal covered both before and after the event. My next goal is to further distinguish between the analysis and dissemination roles of the media. While I argue that the journal's primary role is to help investors understand earnings, they might also make investors more aware of earnings. So to address this, I compare the word similarity of the press release, the earnings press release, and the Wall Street Journal article. Several prior studies suggest that low document similarity reflects the production of economically meaningful original analysis. The measure divides the number of words the two documents have in common, or the intersection of their word sets, by the number of total words in both documents, or the union of their word sets, and I multiply by -1 so that analysis is higher when the documents have fewer words in common. I use a difference in differences design to compare changes in market reactions of the treatment firms to changes in the market reactions of the control firms. Specifically, I regress several market outcomes on an indicator, I label it post, that I set to 1 for treatment firms during periods with Wall Street Journal coverage. And I interact this indicator with the analysis variable to test whether the treatment effect is concentrated among articles that provide the most original analysis. I first find that there's more trading volume when an article published in the journal covers a firm's earnings announcement. Now, if this increased trading reflects the journal helping investors become more informed, then prices might also reflect earnings sooner. And in fact, I next find that the short window price response to earnings is larger, and that earnings news is incorporated into price faster in the days immediately following the announcements covered by the journal. And as I expected, when I compare the text of the press release and journal article, my results are concentrated among Wall Street Journal articles with more original analysis and less content from the firm's press release. Now, this figure shows my difference in differences estimates for each quintile of analysis. So along the y-axis reflects the magnitude and confidence intervals of the post coefficients, and the quintile rank of analysis is increasing along the x-axis. Then importantly, this line at 0 represents the benchmark of having no Wall Street Journal article covering the earnings announcement. The takeaway here is that articles with the most original analysis increase earnings announcement trading volume by about 12% of the unconditional sample average. By contrast, the effect is absent among articles that disseminate the most press release content. Next, I find that the price response to earnings, or the earnings response coefficient, is about 40% larger when there's a high analysis article. And again, there's no difference between having no article and having a low analysis article. I also find that high analysis articles speed up the price response to earnings. So in summary, my results suggest that journalists' analyses impact investors' trading decisions by creating information at earnings announcements, and that the traditional business press's ability to attract readers includes analyzing earnings. In future research, I plan to build on this study by examining what it is about human reporters that explains why some of their articles simply disseminate what the firm has said, which doesn't seem to add value here, while others provide original analysis, which seems to help investors. Now, whether to fill an analysis or dissemination role is a key decision facing the business press right now, given the increasingly intense competition among media outlets for consumers' attention. As an example of the pressure facing the business press, in a recent interview with a journalism think tank, the journal's editor explained that they've cut several sections and focused more on their core economics and business reporting because their advertising revenue decreased by about 20%. Now, much of this pressure on the business press's traditional model has been driven by advances in dissemination technology. Since newswires, computer algorithms, and even social media can increasingly disseminate information at basically no cost, journalists, media firms, will likely continue to supply costly analysis only if it helps them attract readers that dissemination wouldn't. My evidence suggests that the business press continues to supply analysis, at least partly because it helps investors understand earnings in ways that dissemination can't. My study also makes several contributions to the academic literature, including studies I mentioned previously suggesting the press increases investors' awareness of earnings. My evidence suggests the business press also helps investors understand earnings. I also build on prior studies suggesting the business press creates information in other settings, such as by uncovering accounting fraud. My evidence suggests that the business press also creates information during routine earnings announcement coverage, which is a setting with relatively low stakes but high time pressure. And finally, my evidence suggests that journalists create information about firms' future cash flows, similar to sell-side analysts. However, journalists might be able to enrich a firm's information environment in ways that analysts can't because journalists reach a broader audience and have incentives that make them more credible. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Questions?